Hi, everyone. Good afternoon to you all. Welcome back to the Edward Kremers Seminar in the History of Pharmacy and Drugs. Thanks so much for being with us today. My name is Lucas Rickert. I'm the George Erdung Chair in the History of Pharmacy here at UW-Madison. I'm also the Historical Director of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. If you'd like to learn more about either the School of Pharmacy or AIHP, you can go where you usually go for things like that. You can check out the websites, aihp.org, or the UW Pharmacy webpage. You can visit us on Facebook or Twitter. Dr. Adam Rathge is with us today. I see him already up there. He's going to talk about Cannabis Cures, Medical Jurisprudence, and the Origins of the War on Drugs. And I'll admit I'm very much looking forward to this talk. But before he begins, I have to thank a few people. So thanks to Kristen Husett, the administrator of this event. It wouldn't be possible without her. Thank you to Naomi Rendina, who's going to act as the moderator today. She just submitted her PhD dissertation, and for the last year, she has been AIHP's social media coordinator. Finally, thanks to Greg Bond, the Assistant Director of AIHP, who has been instrumental in developing some of the stellar graphics involved with this, like the one you see up now. So thanks to you all. I'm going to repeat what I've said at other Kreminars. I want to just make sure that everyone who's involved has a sense of the background. Edward Kremers is the namesake of this seminar series. He was the second director of the UW Department of Pharmacy and later the UW Madison School of Pharmacy. At the same time, he's a co-founder of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. Kremers invited critical thought about drug consumption and control in the U.S. He encouraged politicians, colleagues in pharmacy, to put on their thinking caps when it came to the language that was used around narcotics, drug, and medicines. Importantly, he at times opposed prohibitionist impulses and prohibitionist organizations, arguing that certain restrictive measures wouldn't necessarily solve the misuse of certain substances. This matters, I think, now more than ever before, especially when we think about how blame may be assigned to marginalized groups and or foreigners for crime and drug addiction. So I've said this before in other Kreminars, but what I haven't said about Edward Kremers is that he was also the director of the Pharmaceutical Experiment Station at the university. And in his capacity as the director of the School of Pharmacy, he promoted a scientific pharmaceutical curriculum as well as humanities training for his students. He did basic research on plant chemistry and was recognized as an expert on the chemistry of certain volatile oils. One of the plants in particular that he studied was cannabis, and he worked closely with pharmaceutical companies in this respect. So that gives you some background, additional background around Kremers. A few other data points for you. For those who are joining us today, just wanted to say that no matter where you are, you're welcome here. We've had participants from over 22 countries being involved with these. We've had over 72 unique institutions from around the world participate. We've never had less than 100 people register for these things, and so I'm very pleased that you're a part of this, to hear what I'm sure is going to be a very excellent and informative talk. The structure for today's talk by Dr. Adam Rathge is similar to what we've done in the past. Following his presentation, we're going to have a conversation and a bit of a Q&A. If you have questions, jot them down in the Q&A box, and then Dr. Rendina is going to moderate. And I'm sure there's going to be many questions. Dr. Rathge holds a PhD in American history from Boston College, and he has written extensively on the history of cannabis in the United States. His recent article, Mapping the Muggleheads, New Orleans and the Marijuana Menace, 1920 to 1930, is a digital humanities project that deploys sort of interactive scholarship, if you will. But not only that, it's got a great title. He's currently the Director of Strategic Operations and Projects for Enrollment Management at the University of Dayton. And he also somehow manages to teach undergraduate courses in the Department of History, as well as manage a new child. So I guess kudos for all that, and thanks so much. And Adam, just so you know, you're muted too right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. Appreciate the introduction. Let me go ahead and see if I can get this shared. How's that look?
Wonderful.
Okay, great. Get myself out of there. So thanks, Luke, for having me. Certainly thanks to Kristen, Greg, Naomi for your roles in getting me here and set up. It's a real honor, a real privilege to be included in the Kreminar, the first, I guess, a series of the Kreminar. A lot of great panelists already, a number of whom I know and respect their work. So it's been a real pleasure joining the past few weeks, and certainly happy to be here today. And thanks to everyone joining us from around the world today. The one great part of not doing these in some conference room on campus somewhere is that we can all be here together. And I'm certainly looking forward to the Q&A later. So I want to start with a big premise today, which is that by charting a longer, more complex and enduring history of cannabis regulation than previous studies have done, I want to explain its transition from therapeutic drug to frightful menace within the context of broader changes in the practice of medicine and pharmacy, as well as the role of federalism in the United States. And from this broader perspective, I argue that cannabis can serve as a lens through which to view the emergence of a vast apparatus of legal mechanisms designed to both restrict consumer access to drugs and eventually police those in violation. And in so doing, reveal what I would suggest is the bifurcation of the nation's drug market, which again, I would suggest is the ideological foundation for the war on drugs. Now, obviously, this is a large premise and a very complex thing, the war on drugs. But today, I want to pull on just one thread, which of course is this cannabis thread. So I want to start, but with an overview, right? What's in a name? So my research charts the medicalization and subsequent criminalization of the drug now widely known as marijuana. Almost no one in the United States, however, used that word until it was slowly introduced from Mexico in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Prior to that, Americans called it hemp or hashish or a variety of other related names, but generally knew it as cannabis, the scientific name given to the genus of plants by Carl Linnaeus. That transition in terminology from cannabis to marijuana helps highlight the crux of my overall argument. So you have a couple of quotes here on the slide from Victor Robinson on the left and D.R. McCresh on the right, both written in 1912. So Robinson on the left held degrees in pharmacy from the New York College of Pharmacy and Columbia University, as well as an MD from the Chicago College of Medicine and Surgery. His book, An Essay on Hashish, published in 1912, chronicled all aspects of cannabis, remarking on its ancient history, its then unknown chemical composition, its physiological and pharmacologic actions, and its recognized therapeutic uses. Robinson highlighted the fact that cannabis, quote, had never produced death, calling it a poison which lacks a maximum and fatal dose. He stressed its remarkable variability, stating that, quote, no drug in the entire materia medica is capable of producing such a diversity of effects as cannabis. He also observed its uncanny ability to mislead the mind with uncontrollable thoughts and distortions of space and time. In short, I'd argue that Robinson captures the general assessment of medicinal cannabis in the early 20th century, namely a powerful but frequently inconsistent drug used for a variety of ailments, but capable of producing a rather startling intoxication. Not many drugs, Robinson wrote, are used for both the brain and the feet. With cannabis, we have this anomaly. A man may see visions by swallowing his corn cure. So on the left, Robinson and the sort of assessment of medicinal cannabis in 1912. Same year, on the right, we have D.R. McCresh writing for the El Paso Herald, and part of the article, of course, is devoted to what he calls the marijuana of the Mexican. And McCresh writes, of all the drugs, marijuana, cannabis indica, or commonly called Indian hemp, experts declare to be the most deadly. Despite this danger, McCresh noted that Juarez drugstores keep it on hand and sell it to anyone who has the purchase price. Often smoked in cigarettes, McCresh noted marijuana most resembled green tea, and its effects, he said, is to greatly magnify things. Leaving the smoker becomes imbued with extraordinary courage and willing to undertake any proposition. More frightfully, perhaps, the tendency of the drug is to throw the user into a frenzied and uncontrollable state, and his desire to satiate himself runs the commission of murders and other crimes. Eventually, McCresh wrote, marijuana, quote, drives them insane, end quote. So I want to argue that these two quotes, they help mark a watershed moment in the United States, highlighting the period when two distinct perceptions of the same drug begin to merge. Robinson, of course, highlighting this general consensus surrounding medicinal cannabis among American physicians, and McCresh signaling the arrival of Mexican ideas about the dangers of marijuana, something that many of you will no doubt recognize in the work of Isaac Campos, who I'll talk a bit more about. In the 25 years that follow these quotes, from 1912 to 1937, some 40 states and municipalities across the United States passed legal restrictions on the sale and use of cannabis or marijuana, culminating, of course, in 1937 with the federal Marijuana Tax Act. Previous studies of this have focused almost exclusively on this period between 1912 and 1937. Locating the impetus for this wave of legislation across the United States and either the xenophobic response to the arrival of Mexican immigrants or the now infamous machinations of Harry J. Anslinger, who you may know as the nation's first drug czar. So generally speaking, you can summarize these two theories in the Anslinger hypothesis or the Mexican hypothesis. And again, Isaac Campos has written pretty extensively on these. But the idea here is that these emerged in the late 60s and early 70s as scholars sought to identify the impetus for anti-marijuana rhetoric and federal prohibition. As Emily Dufton so eloquently walked us through last week, this is exactly the moment when the United States is decriminalizing marijuana across the early 1970s. And so the question was that why is marijuana illegal in the first place? And so the answer was someone or something must have sparked this sudden outcry against marijuana in the early 20th century. I'm here to suggest that these interpretations are both dated and incomplete, especially when they are coupled with the popular impression that cannabis was something of a 19th century miracle drug, a rarely abused intoxicant, and a widely used medicine. Indeed, this wonder drug portrayal has propelled an influential premise that something or someone must have sparked this sudden outcry. And these paradigms have lasted well into the present. If you may remember, back in 2014, the New York Times came out in favor of marijuana legalization in the United States. And in their week-long editorial, day 4, which relied heavily on Bonnie and Whitebread's work, which you see there on the right, the marijuana conviction, declared that the headline declared that federal marijuana ban is rooted in myth and xenophobia. So the Anslinger hypothesis, the Mexican hypothesis, have carried significant weight for 40, 50 years at this point. Now, I'd be remiss before I move on to not mention that there have been some challenges to this premise. In 1983, Jerome Himmelstein argued that the real motivating factor in driving federal marijuana prohibition was not its association with Mexicans, but the belief that marijuana use was spreading rapidly among school children. Now, that's a position that I generally agree with, though Himmelstein also argued that there was no real widespread media coverage of any marijuana menace, a position which I disagree with. But that's all certainly something I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A. In 2006, Dale Geringer's study of marijuana prohibition in California demonstrated that progressive regulatory zeal, rather than any xenophobic response to Mexican immigrants, drove the state's early legislation. And most recently, Isaac Campos has essentially struck at the very core of the Mexican hypothesis, showing that marijuana use was not even remotely a common practice in Mexico, confined largely instead to marginalized sites like prisons and soldiers' barracks. Campos also has shown that Mexicans believed marijuana to be pretty much the most dangerous drug, and that it triggered violence and madness, belief that led Mexico to federally prohibit marijuana in 1920, some 17 years before the United States. But by and large, these challenges are again largely focused on the early 20th century and or at the arguments posited within the Anslinger and Mexican hypothesis, again neglecting the second half of the 19th century and leaving intact the idea that cannabis was a widely used wonder drug in the 19th century. So, was that really the case? Was the 19th century the golden age of cannabis? There certainly seems to be evidence for its medical use and maybe even some recreational uses, like the hashish candy advertisement that you see here on this slide. However, Bonnie and Whitebread devoted just 5 pages of their seminal book to examining cannabis prior to 1900. They asserted, in short, that cannabis quickly achieved popularity for a wide variety of treatments, and that there was no evidence that pharmaceutical preparations of cannabis were used for intoxicating purposes during the 19th century. More recently, Martin Booth has provided a slightly more extended analysis on the medical and recreational uses of cannabis in the 19th century, but essentially reached the same conclusions. Booth noted that the range of cannabis medicines was wide, despite several fundamental problems, which led some doctors to regard them with caution. Booth nonetheless called the 19th century a golden age for cannabis and emphasized its many personal and experimental uses and cannabis intoxication. Again, by portraying this period as one largely devoid of problems with cannabis, these studies create the impression that it was a widely used wonder drug, and that the anti-marijuana consensus of the early 20th century emerged suddenly in the face of either Mexican immigration or Harry J. Anslinger's Reefer Madness campaign. I want to argue that the origins of marijuana prohibition were actually already well established, rooted in the medical discourse and social concern and legislative restrictions on cannabis that emerged in the second half of the 19th century. Indeed, I'm going to argue that this understudied period is critical in categorizing cannabis as a potentially dangerous drug and in establishing the cultural and legal basis for a bifurcated drug market divided into legitimate and illegitimate source uses. in short, I want to suggest that the sustained development of this medical, social, and legal structure in the 19th century set a broad precedent for the regulation of cannabis in the United States that served as a foundation for the arrival of this marijuana rhetoric in the 1910s, the emergence of marijuana, anti-marijuana sentiment in the 1920s, and of course, eventually the federal prohibition of marijuana in the 1930s. So I want to do that by way of an anecdote here. In 1869, Dr. Horatio Wood Jr., seen here, an extensive contributor to medical journals in the United States and a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, published a prize-winning essay entitled On the Medicinal Activity of the Hemp Plant as Grown in North America. In the essay, Wood sought to test the reigning belief that cannabis plants grown in India contained more active resin than cannabis plants grown in Europe or the United States. It was due to this belief that most medical specimens of cannabis were grown in India, and the time and distance necessary to transport those plants to Western pharmaceutical manufacturers often led to the deterioration of the resin and issues in standardizing medicinal cannabis preparations. A quick shout out to Chris Duvall, who a couple of weeks ago on the Kreminar expounded on this in fascinating ways and looked at the intricacies of why this was the case. So if you want to know more about that, please go check Chris's recording. He dives into that and shows some nuances and what kind of cannabis plants actually made it to the West. Anyway, Dr. Wood here hypothesized the differences in active resin were not innate to the Indian-grown plants and that it could easily be explained by soil, climate, things of that nature. And so to prove this, he got a quantity of cannabis grown near Lexington, Kentucky, and prepared a resinous extract. Then, in a highly common practice for 19th century physicians, Wood tested that cannabis preparation on himself. The resulting symptoms included bouts of hilarity, excitation, distortions of space and time, disordered thoughts, and even a, quote, foreboding, undefined, horrible fear as of impending. Rather than scare him away, however, these startling effects signaled Wood's success. In fact, much to his delight, the symptoms were quite similar to those frequently reported by fellow physicians in professional medical journals. For Wood, his experiment proved American-grown cannabis could contain a sufficient abundance of the active principle, powerful enough to produce the widely recognized symptoms of what is called cannabis poisoning. Now, Wood's experiment, no doubt, offers us a fascinating view on the nature of professional medicine in the 19th century. But my argument for our purposes today relies most heavily on the results of that essay, especially this concept of cannabis poisoning. I'd like to suggest that the experience of 19th century physicians like Wood and the well-documented symptoms of cannabis poisoning reveal this longer, more complex road to marijuana prohibition in the United States than previous studies have considered. Indeed, in the second half of the 19th century, this was a critical period in the history of cannabis regulation in the United States. And between the Civil War and the turn of the century, states across the country passed a variety of laws and regulations aimed at curtailing access to dangerous drugs and poisons, including cannabis. So I believe that analyzing the experiences of these 19th physicians like Wood offers us an insight into how and why those first legal restrictions on cannabis developed, how those regulations helped lay the foundation for subsequent marijuana prohibition, and in some ways the sort of Anslinger's propaganda as well. And moreover, they reveal the slow bifurcation of the nation's drug market into licit and illicit uses, thereby providing the ideological foundations of the war on drugs. To understand why these regulations emerged, though, we need to take a closer look at the state of medicine and pharmacy in the 19th century. So why cannabis in the first place? Well, like many 19th century physicians Wood experimented with cannabis for the sake of advancing science and medicine. The validity of individual experimentation and personal narratives was an accepted form of professional knowledge creation throughout the 19th century, and it led doctors like Wood to experiment with a variety of drugs, and of course cannabis was no exception. Now, why American physicians did this? They were spurred by a series of medical experiments conducted in India by Dr. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. And O'Shaughnessy's work on cannabis was promptly circulated in medical journals, such that one suggested that cannabis would cause a great sensation among the members of the profession throughout the world. In the decades that followed, these experiments and observations by American physicians were regularly chronicled by the nation's leading medical journals, one of which you see here, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, which became the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. John Bell in 1857 said that basically experimented with cannabis and hashish on himself, and the editors of the Medical and Surgical Journal wrote that they should be repeated on others equally capable of noting and recording the results. And this happened basically throughout the 19th century. So in the 1870s and 1880s, 1890s, you see throughout the period medical journals chronicling these various physicians either on themselves or their patients and experimenting with cannabis. And now so obviously some of these experiments were no doubt propelled by personal curiosity. Some of them admit as much. Others were, of course, driven by this professional desire to better utilize cannabis extracts for medical treatment. And still others were sort of driven by fascination with the myriad effects that cannabis could supposedly cause. So, of course, those outcomes varied quite widely. Now, perhaps it's not surprising that some of the descriptions found in these 19th century accounts of cannabis intoxication align closely with commonly held perceptions of both medical and recreational marijuana in the 21st century. Things like happiness, contentment, contracted pupils, mental excitement, uncontrollable laughter. These were all things regularly associated with cannabis use in the medical journals of the 19th century. In 1862, for example, the one you see here, Dr. W.A.D. Pierce wrote that after taking cannabis, he felt, quote, totally absorbed in the music, while a deep, subdued happiness, such as I never felt before, pervaded my whole being. Pierce also wrote that he experienced dry mouth and a great feeling of warmth throughout his body, who again commonly reported side effects of cannabis to this day. In the pages of 19th century medical journals, cannabis was also regularly noted to increase the appetite, provide deep and restful sleep. These were two characteristics of cannabis that physicians found particularly useful when assessing its potential benefits against other drugs. Numerous physicians found that cannabis carried important advantages over opium, the other widely used drug, of course, in the 19th century, in that cannabis would not diminish the appetite, check secretions, or constipate the bowels like opium tended to do. By the 1870s, the United States Dispensatory noted that the complaints with which cannabis has been specially recommended were large, right? So we have neuralgia, gout, rheumatism, tetanus, hydrophobia, epidemic cholera, convulsions, scoria, hysteria, mental depression, delirium tremens, insanity, uterine hemorrhage, spasms, nervous inquietude, and just general pain relief. In short, by the late 19th century, cannabis was indeed tested and used as a medical treatment for a variety of ailments. Descriptions of its effects clearly mirrored those positive reactions most often associated with recreational and medicinal uses of marijuana today. Not surprisingly, of course, these are the types of positive descriptions and uses of cannabis from the 19th century that have often been used to bolster the idea that cannabis was once a revered and widely used medicine and little feared intoxicant. Viewed historically in this capacity, it has been easy to point to other causes for the sudden emergence of marijuana prohibition in the United States, especially, of course, the Mexican immigrant, Mexican hypothesis, or Commissioner Anslinger of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. But this is not the complete story of cannabis in the 19th century. Indeed, American physicians also regularly highlighted a series of negative and often frightening symptoms associated with cannabis use. Generally referred to as cannabis poisoning or cannabis overdose, these negative reactions often tempered otherwise optimistic expectations for medicinal cannabis. In 1957, for example, Dr. John Bell wrote of his experience with cannabis, again in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, noting that on the first trial, one is generally frightened at the intensity and violence of its action. A few years later, in 1861, Dr. Charles Lee reported several cases of patients under his care receiving cannabis treatment in which, quote, no good followed, and on the contrary, unpleasant effects were produced. In 1862, again, W.A.D. Pierce concluded that, quote, to feel oneself under the influence of hashish is to feel oneself in the iron grip of a demon who directs one's every moment and thought. Alarm, surprise, and confusion enthrall the reason while fancy reigns. Medical doctors like Bell and Lee and Pierce regularly recorded such negative outcomes when administering cannabis to patients or on themselves. The list of these included distortions of space and time, illusions, hallucinations, erosion of the will, anxiety and racing thoughts, a profound sense of two-ness or out-of-body experience, a fear of impending death. All of these things regularly noted following the use of cannabis. These documented cases of poisoning by cannabis and the adverse effects they often had on patients and users regularly occupied the pages of American medical journals. Indeed, these warnings of these negative effects spread through journals, so much so that some physicians discontinued their use of cannabis medicines entirely. Others advocated starting patients with very small doses and increasing them slowly, something we hear a lot about today. And in self-administering physicians, conducting personal experimentations with cannabis often did so only with other doctors present so that they could be cared for, as well as have their symptoms recorded. These negative experiences with cannabis helped establish a perception of the potential dangers associated with its use. Moreover, those symptoms most frequently associated with cannabis overdose, things like distortions of space and time, or hallucinations, or disordered thoughts, erosion of the will, these were all well suited to an emerging late 19th century fear that habitual drug use could undermine the autonomy and agency of individual users. Cannabis was readily perceived to undermine the mental and moral character of its users, helping bolster fears around its status as a potentially dangerous drug. There was also a generalized belief that, like many other drugs, cannabis could be abused recreationally. For example, in a response to a series of overdoses caused by hashish candies, like the image we saw earlier, an 1866 editorial from the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal asked, quite lamentingly actually, how largely cannabis indica is used amongst us for the purposes of pleasurable intoxication cannot, of course, be definitely known, but we believe much more generally than is commonly supposed. Some 20 years later, temperance advocates in the 1880s felt that habitual drinkers might turn to the drugstore for their pleasure, where opium, morphine, and Indian hemp would take the place of rum. And when combined, these kind of frightening potential of cannabis, fears of habitual use led physicians and reformers to place cannabis right alongside arsenic or chloroform or opium or ether or other drugs. Essentially the fear was that they would be abused recreationally as well. So the two examples you have here from Dr. Fred Hubbard and Dr. H.H. Kane. On the left, you have Hubbard's The Opium Habit and Alcoholism, which included a section on cannabis. Hubbard noted that large doses of cannabis indica taken either medicinally or for pleasure could cause unpleasant effects. He offered stories of a young druggist and others chronicling these types of experiences. Overall, Hubbard argued, quote, its disagreeable effects when taken in excessive quantities counterbalance any pleasing sensations, a fact which lessens the danger of forming a habit of its user and leaves no incentive to its abuse. Nevertheless, Hubbard noted, there are unfortunately exceptions to this, where the action of the drug fascinates the devotee, influencing him to commit fearful excess, ending in extreme debility, the mind becomes imbecile, and ultimately death ensues. In short, Hubbard believed the overpowering negative effects of cannabis might limit its recreational abuses, but nonetheless that some may become enthralled with those sensations, and they would likely face a dire fate. Hubbard still nonetheless believed in the efficacy of cannabis medicines. He advocated making sure doctors got the best quality specimens, administered the proper doses, and made sure that medicinal effects didn't basically lead to this exciting stimulation. And so Hubbard believed that cannabis could aid in the treatment of a range of ailments, but of course then remained dangerous in large doses. And certainly dangerous to a subset of users. On the right, we have Dr. H.H. Kane, book called Drugs That Enslave from 1881 as well. And Kane, again, wrote quite widely on the symptomatology, prognosis, and treatment of various habits, what he called opium, morphine, chloral, and hashish. He devoted a full chapter to cannabis and reached many of the same conclusions as Hubbard. Kane, for example, asserted that in point of continual craving, we might, I think, arrange these drugs in the following order: morphine or opium, chloral, hashish, and alcohol. Yet, in his estimation, it was actually easier to permanently destroy the habit for opium and morphine than it was for hashish and alcohol, because they had a more intense daily or hourly craving. This meant that ridding oneself of the hashish habit might actually be more difficult than the opium habit. This was due to Kane's belief that the desire for hashish was quite unpredictable. It kind of came out at odd times in peculiar circumstances. Kane did warn that habitual cannabis use would rival other drugs if physicians were, quote, able to procure a thoroughly reliable extract of hemp in this country and use it as freely and as carelessly and as in large doses as they are using opium, morphine, and chloral. Again, highlighting the sort of inability to standardize preparations of cannabis, but he feared that if they did, that the sort of same outcome would be along the lines of opium, morphine. So combined, Hubbard and Kane illuminate the many common perceptions of cannabis in the late 19th century, including its regular inclusion alongside other potentially dangerous drugs, right? So that you get these emerging classifications that land cannabis alongside or label cannabis as a hypnotic, an anodyne, a narcotic, a stimulant, a poison, right alongside other drugs like opium, arsenic, and chlorophyll. And at the same time, if this emerging fear of this recreational abuse, certainly not, things that might undermine the autonomy or individual users. And so most users at this point believe that cannabis, like most drugs, can be both helpful and harmful. The solution to this problem, of course, was to restrict access to these drugs by law. So, propelled by a desire to regulate the potential dangers of medicines and poisons, as well as a growing fear of habitual drug use, states across the country continually search for legal remedies to alleviate these concerns throughout the second half of the 19th century. The question slowly evolved from whether or not states could or should restrict access to potentially dangerous drugs, but how. The goal, as Dr. C.B. Guthrie proclaimed in 1860, was, quote, a remedy for an acknowledged evil. As a range of pharmaceutical products became increasingly available to the public following the Civil War, the role of medical doctors and pharmacists as guardians of these potentially dangerous substances occupied a central place in the debate. Part of this stemmed from a desire to solidify the professional status of doctors and pharmacists, but the shift toward regulation was also driven by a desire to protect the average consumer from an increasingly specialized, complex, and often dangerous marketplace for drugs. As a result, many states passed laws regulating items like record keeping and adulteration, and packaging and labeling, and age limits and prescription refill limits, all kinds of things to curb access to drugs. Some of them included a New York law in 1860 that essentially prohibited the sale of any poison or poisonous substance without recording the name in the book, basically without a written prescription, a witness of the sale, and as well as the authorizing physician's name and location written on the bottle, as well as the word poison written in all red ink with the precise name of the poison written in plain and legible characters. So as you can see here on the left, we have cannabis medicine labeled with poison, exactly as a New York law might stipulate, to say, have basically keep in line with these new regulations. You see these emerging, labels and things like that for refills and this kind of stuff. A decade later, you have an 1872 law from Kentucky passed a statute to allow forced supervisions of persons under the influence of habitual or excessive use of opium, arsenic, hashish, or any other drug. That you see as sort of a response to the Hubbard and Kane line of thinking, where these things become more recreational or habitual and excessive. The other one you see here is New Jersey in 1866, where they passed an act to regulate the practice of pharmacy, outlining acceptable practices and enumerating a recognized set of dangerous poisons under the designation of Schedule A, where you can see, of course, Indian hemp listed alongside a variety of other what were considered medicines and poisons. You can also see this idea of scheduling, which we are much more familiar with due to the Controlled Substances Act. The Schedule A, they also had a Schedule B. So the idea here was, of course, they were putting things that were more dangerous in different schedules. So stretching from the Civil War to the turn of the century, these laws highlight the perception of danger surrounding cannabis and the ways in which its use was regulated alongside other drugs. Such broad legislative action across the country belies the entrenched idea that cannabis was a widely praised medicine and little feared intoxicant during the late 19th century. Indeed, the evidence shows that though cannabis was regularly tested and administered as a medicine, it was readily also considered potentially dangerous. And though it's true that physicians often recommended cannabis for a wide range of ailments, they rarely did so unequivocally. A more complete picture of their assessment shows a far more opaque appraisal of cannabis. In short, by the late 19th century, most observers believed that cannabis could be both helpful and harmful. It was in line with most other drugs. It was this understanding that landed cannabis alongside opium and these other drugs as the targets of broad state-level efforts to regulate and restrict the sale of medicines and poisons. Though, of course, few of these laws would be considered strict drug prohibitions in the manner reflected in today's war on drugs, they were legal restrictions nonetheless, and they established a medico-legal framework for the continued restriction of cannabis in the future. Ultimately, though, this broad regulatory trend, moves into the 20th century and in a lot of ways culminates in the 1906 Food and Drug Act. But before I move to the federal level, I want to do a quick shout out, of course, to Kremers and Erdang and the History of Pharmacy, the 4th edition, which you see here. A lot of shout outs because the other one is it's revised by Glenn Sonnedecker from none other than the University of Wisconsin. Big shout out to Chapter 13, which was a fundamental. I relied heavily on this book to formulate my understanding of the rise of legislative standards in pharmacy in the United States. And of course, we're here at the Kremers Kreminar on cannabis, and so I had to throw the quick shout out in to Kremers and Erdang and the History of Pharmacy. But on to the federal manifestations of these laws. Right? So the 19th century drug control measures evolved in the early 20th century. They formed the foundation for an increasingly bifurcated drug market. In the early 20th century, these restrictive laws evolved in ways that codified the nation's drug market into legitimate and illegitimate uses. Right? Drugs used under the care of a licensed physician remained regulated but licit, while all non-medical uses slowly became illicit and increasingly prohibited. The status of cannabis as a potentially dangerous drug landed it on both sides of that licit and illicit bifurcation, and that remained on display in legislation throughout the early 20th century. As its medicinal status rapidly declined, however, cannabis became increasingly the target for solely just illicit prohibition. So in many ways, those 19th century laws that we were just looking at culminate in the 1906 Food and Drug Act, which in many ways is simply a truth in labeling law. And the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act did include cannabis, and that's no surprise, right? It was essentially a federal iteration of those statewide regulations, and cannabis was included alongside these other drugs. Just 8 years later, though, the nation's foundational drug law, known as the Harrison Narcotics Act, excludes cannabis, despite some desire by testifying experts to include it. Now, why was it left out? Declining medical use, concerns about the constitutionality of the law itself, let alone the constitutionality of including a drug that could potentially be grown in any state and therefore would not require interstate commerce. There were wholesale and trade group lobbyists. There were all kinds of things that sort of worked against marijuana or cannabis being included. Now, I slipped there because the word marijuana never comes up in the debate over the Harrison Narcotics Act, which gets back to my earlier point about 1912 and the sort of arrival of this term. And so even in 1914, the debate over the Harrison Narcotics Act, there's no mention of the word marijuana, demonstrating how uncommon that word remained well into the 20th century. Fundamentally, Harrison was a taxation act, and in some ways it was a loophole by Congress to regulate medicine, something that few commentators in the 19th century would have believed possible. And despite that, Harrison, of course, survived its initial tests from the Supreme Court and opened physicians up to prosecution for prescribing the opiates and cocaine. Its exclusion of cannabis, however, meant that cannabis remains solely under the auspices of local control. Rather than fade from view, though, states and municipalities throughout the country moved to further restrict cannabis despite its exclusion from this federal law. By 1918, states from Maine to California had done so. So too had municipalities including Portland, Oregon, Albuquerque, New Mexico, El Paso, Texas, New York City. And in previous interpretations of marijuana prohibition in the United States, this crucial period was one that coincided with the arrival of Mexican immigrants that drove reactionary and xenophobic legislation. Yet in the early decades of the 20th century, states far removed from the Southwest and Mexican immigration also passed laws against cannabis. This is especially true in regions like New England, where Massachusetts in 1911, Maine in 1914, Vermont in 1915, and Rhode Island in 1918, not in New England, but Indiana is also in there in 1913, all passed legislation aimed at regulating cannabis. The passage you see here was part of the Massachusetts law and may mark the first law in the United States against the personal or proximal possession of cannabis. The Massachusetts law then helps us demonstrate the ongoing influence of 19th century perception of cannabis and its regular inclusion among the drugs covered by laws restricting the sale of medicines and poisons. Now, obviously, in 1911, Massachusetts was not facing any influx of Mexican immigrants. What you see is essentially just the continuation of these 19th century perceptions of cannabis and the desire to regulate dangerous drugs. Massachusetts was not alone, however. In fact, none of the first 7 statewide restrictions on cannabis passed in the United States between 1911 and 1915, not a one of them used the term marijuana. And so, again, absent Mexican immigration or even marijuana terminology, these state legislatures merely continued the work of their 19th century predecessors. However, and moreover, even in states that did grapple more directly with Mexican immigration, we can see the medico-legal frameworks established in the late 19th century at work, with a clear regulatory structure that was already in place for easily incorporating the arrival of marijuana. In Texas, which you see here, the state legislature amended an existing narcotics law to include, as you can see listed, cannabis indica, cannabis sativa, or preparation thereof, or any drug or preparation from cannabis, any cannabis variety, or any preparation known and sold under the Spanish name of marijuana. Again, following language similar to the 19th century, but now including the term marijuana. Now, let me stress quickly that none of this is meant to discount or discard the role of racism and xenophobia in this process. Rather, I'm trying to demonstrate the ways in which statewide measures like these reflect in both structure and intent the continuing influence of late 19th century medico-legal foundations and long-held perceptions on the dangers of cannabis, as well as this slow bifurcation of the nation's drug market into illicit and licit spheres. So this brings us back to our opening characters, Victor Robinson, Dr. Robinson, and D.R. McCresh in 1912. This moment that I'm suggesting is the merger of these 19th century medical perceptions of cannabis with the alarming descriptions of marijuana intoxication, as well as the emerging bifurcation of the nation's drug market, right? So you have Victor Robinson talking about sort of a 19th century corn cure, which cannabis was included in. You have McCresh talking about the availability of marijuana in drug stores. It was not on the shelves, as advertised as marijuana, as cannabis product in all likelihood, right? In the 25 years that follow, we see rapidly declining medicinal use, and therefore Robinson's concerns about swallowing the corn cures are essentially wholly replaced with the fear of McCresh's Marijuana Menace and the ideas floating around coming from Mexico and the dangers of marijuana, right? This, of course, culminates in 1937 with what I'll call the Coda here, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Modeled on a prohibitive tax principle found in the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Marijuana Tax Act was, again, technically a taxation measure similar to the Harrison Narcotics Act. In principle, the Marijuana Tax Act outlawed the non-medical, untaxed possession or sale of marijuana. Unlike the Harrison Act, though, which used written order forms and physician registration fees and related methods to collect revenue to enforce the line between medical and non-medical use of opiates and cocaine, the medicinal use of marijuana had all but disappeared by 1937, and thus there was little revenue to collect. The procedures necessary to be in compliance with the MTA were also quite complex, and its registration process essentially allowed Treasury Department officials and FBN agents to monitor the behavior of anyone who actually did legally register under the MTA. Few, of course, bothered to do so, and as a result, most all possession of marijuana in the United States is a crime. Just a few years later, in 1942, as a final blow to any possible legitimate cannabis use in the United States, the 12th revision of the Pharmacopoeia of the United States went to print without a section on cannabis for the first time since 1850. So in tandem, the Marijuana Tax Act and the revised USP marked the end of a full century of medicinal cannabis use in the United States, leaving only the policing of illicit use and the ideological foundations of the emerging war on drugs, which I would say have a clear link to the medical jurisprudence of physicians and pharmacists in the 19th century. Thank you. Looking forward to the Q&A.
Hey, Dr. Rathge, thanks so much.
My pleasure.
It's a really stimulating and I guess at times kind of provocative paper, isn't it? I mean, you're playing around with some of these sort of well-received tropes in cannabis history, and complicating some of these narratives that we've created over the past 15, 20 years, I think, of really solid cannabis scholarship. I bet you there's tons of questions out there that Naomi is ready to ask, but I'm going to just ask something first.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Yeah,
that's the reason I wanted to jump in right away is because here at the UW School of Pharmacy, a brand new class is being taught on the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoids for third and fourth year pharmacy students. And so I was asked to give one lecture in the whole class. And it got me thinking a little bit about your research, and I guess what I've been thinking about as you were talking was some of the education practices, the pharmacy education that students got in your period.
Yeah, so a lot of the 19th century regulation is geared around just that. Like, what is the actual curriculum going to be at pharmacy schools? And you also have the simultaneous emergence of the professional bodies that we now most associate with the being either a physician or a pharmacist, right? So the American Pharmaceutical Association is formed, the American Medical Association is formed, and so you have a lot of hand-wringing over, what does it mean to be a physician, and what does it mean to be a pharmacist, and by and large, and this is not entirely my research. This is certainly others out there who have worked on this. The move in the mid 19th century is to professionalize both medicine and pharmacy. And especially the pharmacists, they feel the pinch from all sides. They feel like physicians are usurping their power by being the prescriber, and they feel like the sort of retail drug industry and the rise of sort of pharmaceutical products, kind of what we would now consider over-the-counter kind of stuff, was undermining their sort of professional credentials as being person who, actually creates the drug or puts it together and provides it to the patient. And so the hand-wringing around that is really what allows essentially professional pharmacy and pharmacy schools and pharmacy education to emerge in that period. And so now, cannabis is, it probably seems like I think cannabis is the most important substance in the 19th century. It's obviously not, but it's on the list, right? And so you see MD dissertations, you see, on cannabis, you see, basically it's one of the many substances that are being explored in the 19th century as a possible treatment. And so you really have the emergence of all this professionalization in an attempt to carve out space that it maintains your professional autonomy. And part of that was, in a lot of ways, creating the danger. I mean, it's obviously a real danger, right? But being the guardian between the consumer or the patient and these dangerous substances. And that's really where the pharmacists and physicians carved their spot. And that's really what drives the legislation and the emergence of these sort of regulatory structures to put the guardian between the consumer or the patient and substances that were deemed dangerous or potentially, later on in the century, more, subject to abuse or recreational use. Yeah.
I'm going to pick your brain more about this, but because but I don't want to be overly selfish at this stage. I'm going to, in fact, turn it over to Naomi Rendina, the moderator. Hopefully, you've been able to sort through some of the questions so far.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Rathge, for such a interesting presentation. We have some questions. We're going to start with Dr. Brito. She asked, well, first she said, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. Can you say more about the interlocutors of this 19th century medical researchers? The negative results of their own research was crucial, but what about other scientists in other parts of the world?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. There are certainly threads in the emergence of these perceptions of cannabis that I didn't get to today, and that it just basically couldn't include for time's sake. There are certainly threads coming from elsewhere in the world. I think actually next week, David Guba is going to talk about France and probably Europe writ large, and some of that, as well as the empire sort of notions. And so the main ones that come to the United States anyway are by and large via Europe and mostly via the United Kingdom and India. And there's an Orientalist thread in some of this, certainly that Chris Duvall talked a little bit about a couple of weeks ago, and this view that Western medicine is going to take these things from sort of the the uneducated savage or what have you, and make them into a better medicine or use it in a better way. And obviously, as Chris has pointed out, there was actually quite a bit of knowledge lost in that process. And so the main thing that you get filtered through into the U.S. medical journals is this sort of Orientalist bent, especially early on, the way that they talk about users elsewhere in the world. And it's almost always Indians, Arabs, or they would say things like the Hottentots or these various other groups that might be associated with cannabis use. And so there are certainly some of those threads that emerge in the medical journals. They kind of fade from view pretty quickly by well, I shouldn't. They don't ever really go away, right? They're still undergirding some of this. The other thing there is there's a literary kind of fascination with cannabis as well. The most prominent Americans in that line are Bayard Taylor and Fitzhugh Ludlow, Ludlow is certainly sort of the father, you might say. He fits in here quite a lot. And a lot of the early discussion around cannabis, you see almost a blending of these two, the literary side and the medical side, and both sides talk about each other. So this is a really interesting piece of it, is that Ludlow, though he writes about being a hashish eater, he's taking a liquid preparation of cannabis that of Tilden's extract that he got from a pharmacist. He's not actually using hashish as we might imagine it in the 21st century. And so he's using a pharmaceutical preparation, and that's his drug of choice, right? And then on the other side of this, you see in really prominent, often cited 19th century medical stuff, you see them citing Taylor or Ludlow or these other folks. Now, they often put it in a box and say, it's kind of literary, has no place here in the medical journal or whatever, and then they go on to quote it anyway. And so both kind of things are being intertwined, especially early on in this period, so 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, when you have, as I was just talking with Luke, this more emergence of these more professional societies and this carving of more professional space. You see less and less of that in the medical journals, but there are certainly threads that don't come from the United States. I think the one thing that stands out for me is that O'Shaughnessy is certainly the person who kicks this all off, but American physicians almost immediately, within a year or two, are calling for their own experiments, their own kind of, they basically have a skepticism of what O'Shaughnessy says. And so American physicians anyway start with a skepticism of the claims of this great sensation that O'Shaughnessy starts. So they do chart their own path, but there's definitely threads from elsewhere in the world.
Did we lose him, or is that just my internet?
I'm here.
Naomi, what else do we have?
Oh, that was my internet that decided to cut out on that. Well, you actually answered a couple questions in that, so that was productive. Great. Dr. Gabriel says, first, thank you for your interesting and insightful talk. His first question, it goes back into more of the racism questions of, so you position racism in the story as a 20th century phenomenon, but he wonders to what extent 19th century racialized discourses about habit, transcendence, and enslavement play a role. So maybe rhetoric around Mexican immigration is a continuation of earlier discourses or a permutation of them, and that your focus on cannabis kind of works to obscure this because of not focusing on other commodities.
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. Thanks, Joe. As you're aware, I cite you extensively in the dissertation. I've taken this into account for sure. I think you're dead right. I think that there is an underlying thread of racism, like in the 19th century, it's a more of an Orientalist bent, but certainly to your point about habitual use or enslavement or these types of things, also undergirded, of course, in the language of slavery in the United States, and linked, of course, to racial dynamics. And so I think you're right. And again, I certainly don't want the presentation today or my broader research to suggest that racism isn't playing a role here. I suppose, as Luke said, it's a little bit maybe I'm stressing these maybe unstressed pieces in a way to illuminate the fact that I think they're also part of the story, right? And so it's not that there's no role for racism throughout this process. It's just that the focus on that has also obscured this sort of underlying, what I would call medical jurisprudence, or this sort of medical legal structures that developed as a means for regulating cannabis. So when you do have, as we're all aware, the arrival of Mexican immigration and the sort of racism around Mexicans linked to marijuana, you have a ready foundation in place to expand that that legal framework, and by that point, cannabis has essentially no medical defenders left, and so the foundation that's in place is readily accelerated in many ways by the arrival of this idea or these concepts or the xenophobia that's linked to it. So it's certainly not that I'm dismissing the racial elements here, more so trying to shine a light on some pieces that I don't think have gotten enough credit as being part of the story.
Great, thank you. So Dr. Higby actually asked a question that actually I want to ask as well. It relates to my own research and pharmaceuticals. Dr. Higby asked, were certain cannabis preparations favored by researchers such as fluid extract or tinctures? Any comment on the problems with standardizing the strength of preparations? Love this question.
Yes, so both. Those are both, fluid extracts and tinctures are the most commonly discussed, and they're definitely there. And the problem of standardization is I mean, you could argue it's still with us in 2020. If you read the news in the current recreational or even potentially medicinal markets, we know a lot more, but there's still how much is too much and this sort of thing going on, and what's proper dosage. But the problems with standardization are, in many ways, you could probably argue the driving factor in a lot of this, right? So I think you could relatively easily suggest that many of these, what are often labeled cannabis poisoning, cannabis overdose, if we lump them in and say that it's a negative outcome, right? In most cases, the physicians chalk that up to either a dose or a preparation that was basically stronger than advertised, or it was or on the opposite side of that is that they get no result, or the patient experiences nothing, or they don't get an outcome, and in that case, they would say that it may be totally inert. And so, the idea that these negative outcomes were potentially just driven by, extracts or tinctures that were just more potent than maybe advertised, I don't think is a huge leap. And so, without those negative outcomes, do you get the same emergence of fear or regulatory drive or for inclusion alongside these other drugs that do have a more potentially more standardized preparation by the 19th century? And so it's essentially the key number one question. Now there are some other related undergirding questions that go along with it, which my anecdote from Wood kind of illuminates. There's a big question on whether Indian-grown cannabis is different than European or American-grown cannabis. And again, this is an ongoing kind of misunderstanding or debate. The differences between indica and sativa, or potentially, ruderalis or these other, various species, and so. Those are underlying questions, right? There's a lot of talk about can you use cannabis grown in the United States to make these preparations, and Procter and Gamble, Eli Lilly, these pharmaceutical firms that we know, or Procter & Gamble, obviously not pharmaceuticals, but these big, what are now big companies, they were working on this problem. And so it is in many ways the problem of cannabis in the 19th century. And you can argue it's why it never really gets a foothold as maybe the medicine that a lot of people think it could be in this, or at least in the present, because it doesn't standardize, or there's an inability to standardize. Now, to put all that in perception, I don't think THC is isolated, if I remember right, in like 1969, and so even the rudimentary understanding of the plant, or the endocannabinoid system, or the myriad cannabinoids that have now been discovered, there's none of that. And so there's quite a debate on the best way to prepare it. There's quite a debate on what the best specimens are to use, male, female, all these kinds of things throughout the 19th century. And the inability to standardize, I think, is really one of those underlying causes for a lot of both the regulation and the declining medical use.
I know in the 19-teens and 1920s, companies like Park Davis were using ethyl alcohol and kind of trying to switch to an acetone-based formulation to do botanical extracts. Did you see any of that in making any of the preparations?
Yeah, both those ring true to me. Though Park Davis, again, this is something that Isaac Campos has written about quite a bit. By the 19-teens, Park Davis's main cannabis product seemed to be loose cannabis in 1-ounce packages, which were frequently sold in drugstores. And he's done some extensive research on, certainly along the border. And so at that point, it was less about fluid extracts, at least for Park Davis, and more about just essentially selling 1-ounce loose packages. And so, in obviously much more of a smokable form in that regard. So by the teens and the 20s, it's less, there's very little, in comparison, very little medical use still happening in comparison to, I mean, heck, by that point you have aspirin and, really standardized kind of laboratory drugs. And so there's very limited attempt still at that point by Park Davis or really anybody else to continue the research to standardize. And you also have to remember there's then also all of these undergirded regulatory structures on the sale of those products, and so you have dual forces working against it.
Right. Thank you for that answer. Andrew Tate, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, has a question from the same time period. But first he says, thank you for sharing your knowledge. Can you speak to any relationship to the Flexner Report of 1910 in contributing to the mistrust of cannabis in the medical community?
I don't know that I'm familiar with the Flexner Report in 1910.
So the Flexner Report, Abraham Flexner went out to multiple genres of professional schools, but most well known for his work visiting medical schools, which ultimately resulted in a standardization of medical school curriculum and practices, which is a whole, I mean, there's multiple books and things on its own,
yeah.
Which I'm no expert on it. Maybe Luke wants to chime in on this question, if at all possible. If you want to skip that question, we can.
I just turned off my video for bandwidth, and now all I'm going to say is that you should maybe connect with Andrew Tate, and I'll connect with him as well, because my knowledge of the Flexner is perhaps not as robust as it should be.
Yeah.
Naomi, are you going to ask another one, or can I ask one quick?
Go ahead and ask a question.
The Muggleheads.
Yeah.
Please tell us what the Muggleheads is all about.
So we didn't get into it today, obviously, but the 1920s in New Orleans, the street term for marijuana or a cigarette, a marijuana cigarette, was a muggle, and so they became Muggleheads. You might argue that it was like 60 years ahead of crackhead term, right? And so Muggleheads in New Orleans were essentially just marijuana users, and so long before also, I guess, the Harry Potter, though I'm horribly unfamiliar with Harry Potter, so no one asked me to make any links to Harry Potter, but apparently Muggleheads are also in Harry Potter. But in New Orleans in the 1920s, they were marijuana smokers, and so I have, as you mentioned in the intro, an article about this, and again in New Orleans, basically my argument there is that what you don't see again in New Orleans is any not no fear, I guess, but you have a limited connection to the problem being related to Mexican immigrants, and what you do see is a lot of Mexican ideas about marijuana, which is that it causes violence and madness, and particularly violence in New Orleans. And what really, coupled with that, what really drives at least local prohibition and New Orleans and a number of New Orleans groups push for federal prohibition in the 20s as well, is that this perceived widespread use among what they would say school-age children. And so what I tried to do was find every newspaper article I could find that mentioned marijuana in New Orleans between, say, 1920 and 1930. And then I built a database of the arrest records and recorded age and race and address and location of arrest and all this other stuff to try and figure out, well, who, was it true or not, right? And by and large, it was borne out, at least by the published arrest records. The typical marijuana user in New Orleans in the 1920s was late teens, early 20s, and white. And so, again, according to what I could find, the newspaper headlines about school children, and maybe not school children, but certainly late teens, early 20s, were the primary users. And so those were the Muggleheads that I referenced. And then if you go check out the article, it's online. We built some GIS maps of all the arrests and the places they lived and these types of things, and so you can get a real feel for where were the arrests happening in the city, where did people who were arrested live, and you kind of see some patterns in the way these things worked. And it's maybe not that unfamiliar with the way that the drug market always works, which is that often people are arrested not where they live, for at least these white users. So they were going places to buy and being arrested, and then you kind of just see the patterns that develop in that way. The other interesting thing about that is that oftentimes is in New Orleans anyway, it's New Orleans and jazz and African Americans, and again, there's very limited, at least in the published newspaper reports, very limited links to that, at least in the 20s anyway. You don't see this focus on African Americans or jazz musicians or whatever. In the 20s anyway, the social angst in New Orleans was directed at use by white school children.
So I actually pulled out my handy dandy desk reference of my copy of the Flexner report. I've actually I actually have an article out on the Western Reserve and Flexner, so whenever this conversation happens, I want in on this conversation.
Sounds good.
The next question actually is another from Dr. Higbee, and I'm going to add on to it because I'm interested in as well. Can you add anything about gender into this conversation, and Dr. Higby puts it in the context of maybe comparing it with opiate use in this period?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. It's not something that I tried to peel back very much in the research. Anecdotally, just from my own reference, it's definitely male-dominated, the evidence that I have. Now, there are certainly cases that I can think of off the top of my head where the physician is male, but they're treating female patients. And in that case, it would be quite in line, I think, with opium, in the sense that oftentimes what they're using cannabis for is for the same kinds of kind of just general kind of like nerves or neuralgia, these sort of 19th century nervous disorder type things as a means for that. The other main thing that cannabis has a brief moment for is its use in childbirth and easing either contractions or uterine hemorrhage and these types of things. And so there is a moment where you can certainly see that as being something that's being tested in the medical journals, but it doesn't seem to really take off in any kind of widespread way, but it definitely shows up as something that is administered during pregnancy as well. But again, it's not a lot of the experiential stuff is often doctors experimenting on themselves, and so male dominated in the 19th century, obviously, and so it's often male voices being portraying it. But that said, like I said, I definitely have examples of female patients having these sort of negative outcomes as well. But by and large, it's a male-dominated written record.
I think that's interesting, and I definitely want to have a conversation with you at some point. I haven't seen, my research looks at drugs in childbirth and like ergot and Pitocin, and I've only seen a few mentions of any sort of cannabis being used. So maybe we can write something together.
Yeah. Like I said, it's certainly not. Never really gets widespread, but I saw it certainly more than one medical journal for sure.
Well, so then that really helps kind of build up to this next question of you cited a homeopathic proving. So how were homeopaths supporting the use of cannabis in contrast to maybe allopaths or any other school of medical thought?
Yeah. It's a great question, and as Luke asked early on, the homeopathic allopathic kind of fight is definitely a piece of this story, but by and large, the assessment is similar. Though you see basically kind of tit for tat people attacking the other side for their various uses. But the general outcomes that you find, or at least the general assessment that you find from homeopaths or allopaths, I didn't notice any major differences. In fact, you can find probably just as many positive endorsements on both sides and just as many negative endorsements on both sides. Or maybe not negative endorsements, but negative outcomes that proceed with caution kind of outcomes. And mainly that's around dosing. And the interesting thing there is that you see this standardization problem, which is that some doctors are saying, you have to start so small and increase very slowly. And then you get other doctors who say cannabis is basically inert and it doesn't work because people aren't using it in large enough quantities. And so you need to start with really large quantities. and so you get both sides of it. And again, I think you could probably boil that down to the standardization problem, is that some people have relatively inert and some people have quite powerful. And so you see kind of both of these narratives emerging that, if only we administered it in larger doses, we'd get better outcomes, or if only we start slow move up slow will avoid negative outcomes, right? So you see both, certainly both narratives. But I think by and large, on both sides of that divide, you probably find kind of the same debates or assessment of cannabis.
Good. So I think we only have time for one last question, and it's going to be Del Rio's question, Dr. Del Rio's question. Were there any voices of resistance against this emergent medical jurisprudence, and who were these people?
Certainly not much in the 19th century. Now there's a more of a legal, maybe constitutional debate around whether regulating pharmacy or medicine is prudent or even constitutional. Certainly that's the sense from federal level, right? Is that the federal government has no constitutional right to regulate medicine. We've seen that event ultimately fall. But in the 19th century, the reason so many states are taking this action, and we have this big patchwork of varying laws, is that no one thinks the federal government can do this stuff. And so states are doing it themselves, right? And so the debate is often, at least in my research, the interesting debate was about whether or not you elucidate the list of drugs or poisons that were covered by the law. And so there were debates on both sides of this, which is one was like, well, you have to name them so pharmacists and doctors and the general public will understand what's dangerous and what's not or what's less dangerous. On the other side of that debate was people who said, well, if you name them, people are going to start using those drugs, or it's going to bring attention to them, or these types of things. The other problem, of course, which we now see with or saw quite a bit with synthetic marijuana and the sort of flash in the pan kind of K2 thing a few years ago, or even maybe potentially in the way that these synthetic drugs change now, is that as soon as you publish the list in that law, it's out of date. And so this was another thing. And so I didn't get to it in the presentation today, but in some of these laws, even the ones that I mentioned, they have the list, and then 2 years later they get rid of the list, and then 4 years later they put the list back in, and then and so they kind of go back and forth on what happens. To take that into the 20th century, though, the interesting thing for me, and where I try to take this argument all the way through to the Marijuana Tax Act, is that I argue you can see in Anslinger's Reefer Madness campaign and the way he talks about the Marijuana Menace and the way he talks about marijuana, I argue that you can see these threads, these foundational undergirding threads from the 19th century and the way that the narratives around cannabis or sort of perceptions around cannabis were created. He is compiling, of course, the most inflammatory and hearsay type stuff related to violence and newspaper stories. But the way he talks about the actual experience of cannabis, you can see direct parallels to the way that people are talking about negative outcomes of cannabis back to the 19th century. And so in the 1937 meetings about the Marijuana Tax Act, he asked point blank the director of the National Institutes of Health whether cannabis causes insanity. And I think it's Votlin is the doctor. And he says, well, I think, basically common belief is that it can and does cause insanity in some people, and in some people it doesn't, or something to that effect, right? And so you even have, some of the nation's highest medical doctors still kind of on this this perception that, yeah, it's bad for some people and for others it's not, kind of thing. And so you can see these threads all the way through. And so what I'm getting at is that Dr. Del Rio asked about pushback. There's not much. There's not much around the anti-marijuana campaigns in the 20s. There's not much around the 1930s. And I think by and large it's because there's no medical defenders left. There's no medical uses left. And so no one charges into the void to say this is crazy. And And they don't, by and large, because there's this huge body of, you could argue, contradictory evidence about the outcomes of cannabis use or excessive use or what have you, that they can go point to. And so now, of course, Anslinger selects only the negative stuff and only the worst of the negative outcomes for his campaign. But there just weren't voices grabbing the sort of positive outcomes that were also in that 100 years of American research on the product or on the drug. And so the long-winded answer to that question is no, there's just not a ton of pushback. The pushback in the 19th century is about legal kind of constitutional issues, and by the 1930s, there's not defenders for cannabis to jump in to the void.
Thank you for the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Rickert, do you want to close us out?
Yes. Thanks so much, Dr. Rathge. It's, like I said, extremely stimulating paper that forces us to rethink some of these conventional narratives around cannabis. And, whether or not you're in Germany or in Mexico or in Europe, thank you all for attending and listening, joining us today. Next week, we have got the final Kreminar. It's Dr. David Guba is going to talk about cannabis in France and the medical debates there. But once more, Dr. Rathge, thanks so much.
Thanks again. Really appreciate you having me. Thanks, everybody.